You ever wake up and realize someone rewrote your property line while you were asleep? The smell hit me first. Fresh cut pine, sharp and raw, like a construction site where something new was being built. Except nothing new was supposed to be happening on my land. Then came the sound. A low metallic drag, slow and deliberate, like steel being pulled across gravel. I stepped out onto my back porch barefoot, coffee still warm in my hand, and that's when I saw it. My fence wasn't where it was supposed to be. 12 years. That fence had stood in the exact same place for 12 years, straight as a survey line, anchored into soil my father and I had dug with our own hands. Now it sat 6 feet deeper into my property, clean posts, fresh cuts, like someone had just decided the boundary needed adjusting. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I just stood there, letting the morning air settle, tasting sawdust, and something else underneath it. Control. That's what this was. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. Someone had moved a line that wasn't theirs to move. I walked the length of it slowly, boots crunching over loose dirt that hadn't been there yesterday. The old post holes were still visible, dark circles in the ground like ghosts of where things were supposed to be. Every step felt off, like walking through a room where all the furniture had been shifted just enough to make you uneasy. At the far end, near the corner where my property met the subdivision road, I saw the marker stake. Bright orange. Clean. Official looking. The kind of thing people plant when they want to pretend legality comes from color-coded plastic. That's when I heard her voice. Smooth. Controlled. Practiced. Good morning, Ethan. I see you've noticed the adjustment. I turned, already knowing who it was. Victoria Hargrove stood at the edge of what used to be my boundary, dressed like she had somewhere important to be, tablet tucked under her arm, sunglasses catching the morning light like a badge. HOA president. 12 years in this neighborhood, and she'd managed to turn a volunteer position into something that felt a lot more permanent. 6 feet. I said, my voice steady, almost curious. That's not an adjustment. That's a decision. She smiled. Not wide. Not warm. Just enough to suggest she thought this. Conversation was already finished. The community needed alignment. Your fence was encroaching on planned access space. Planned. That word hung in the air heavier than anything else. Plan meant they talked about this. Approved it. Maybe even celebrated it. Without me. I looked past her then, toward the main road that fed into the subdivision. The entrance sat there like it always had. Decorative stone pillars. Clean asphalt. A neat little sign with the neighborhood name etched in polished metal. Everyone drove through it. Delivery trucks. School buses. Every single car that belonged to Victoria's carefully managed community. I took a slow breath, letting the air settle in my chest, grounding everything back into place. Because here's the thing about lines. You don't really notice them until someone moves one. And once they do, you start looking at every other line a little differently. Victoria adjusted her sunglasses, waiting for me to argue, to raise my voice, to play the part she'd already written for me in her head. I didn't. I just nodded once, slow and deliberate, like I was agreeing with something she hadn't actually said. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't see standing there on her side of the fence, was that she hadn't just moved a boundary. She'd just shown me exactly where hers really was. I did not touch the fence that morning. Not because I could not, but because I needed to understand exactly what they thought they had done. The air still carried that sharp scent of fresh wood as I walked back inside, boots leaving faint dust prints across the kitchen tile. My coffee had gone cold on the counter, a thin skin forming on top, untouched. That felt about right. Some things change temperature fast. Others take their time. I pulled the old folder from the bottom drawer near the fridge, the one I had not opened in years. Thick paper, worn edges, the kind of documents that do not get replaced, only preserved. My father used to keep it wrapped in plastic like it was something sacred. Deeds, survey maps, handwritten notes and margins that only made sense if you knew the land the way he did. I spread everything across the table, flattening corners with my palm, feeling that familiar texture of paper that had outlived more than a few arguments. The original survey was there. Clean. Lines. Measured in feet and inches, not guesses and opinions. That fence had not been off by accident. It had been placed exactly where it was supposed to be. I traced the boundary line slowly, following it toward the edge where my property met the subdivision. That is when I noticed it again. Not for the first time, just the first time it mattered. The access strip, 12 feet wide, running right along the edge, marked clearly as a private easement. Not theirs. Mine. The memory clicked into place like a latch. When I bought this land, the realtor mentioned it in passing. Shared access potential, she called it. Sounded harmless. At the time, the subdivision had not even been finished. No entrance. No traffic. Just empty land and a future someone else was planning. I remember asking my father about it. He just nodded and said, "As long as you own the dirt, you control who crosses it." I sat there for a moment, letting that settle. Outside, I could hear the distant hum of a car passing through the neighborhood entrance. Tires on asphalt. Routine. Predictable. Assumed. That entrance. The one with the stone pillars and polished sign. It sat exactly where that easement touched the road. Not fully on my land. Not fully off it either. Just enough overlap to matter if someone ever decided to look closely. I leaned back in the chair, wood creaking under my weight, and for the first time since that morning, I allowed myself a small breath that was not tight with frustration. Victoria thought this was about alignment. About aesthetics. About control over how things looked from the street. But she had made a mistake. She had turned something invisible into something I could measure. And once something can be measured, it can be proven. I gathered the papers carefully, stacking them in order, sliding them back into the folder with more intention than before. This was no longer about a fence. That was just the surface. What mattered was the assumption sitting underneath everything they had done. The belief that nobody would check. Nobody would push back. Nobody would understand the difference between what looked official and what actually was. I grabbed my keys from the counter, the metal cold in my hand, and stepped back outside. The fence stood there, 6 feet deeper into my land, clean and confident like it belonged. I walked past it without slowing down, heading toward the road, toward the entrance they were so proud of. Up close, the details were even clearer. The edge of the asphalt did not quite line up with the county marker. The base of the stone pillar crossed just enough into that easement strip to make things complicated. I crouched slightly, running my fingers along the seam where gravel met pavement, feeling the shift in texture. Solid. Permanent. Or at least, that is what they thought. A car rolled past me into the neighborhood, the driver barely glancing in my direction. To them, this was just a road. An entrance. A given. But I could see it now for what it really was. A line. One they had been crossing every single day without even realizing it. I stood up slowly, brushing dust from my hands, and looked back toward my house. Toward the fence. Toward the 6 feet they had taken like it was nothing. My jaw tightened just slightly, not with anger, but with clarity. Because the truth was simple. They did not just move my boundary. They stepped into one of theirs. And unlike a fence, this one came with paperwork. By noon, the smell of fresh cut wood had faded, replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. Paper. Ink. The kind of preparation that does not make noise but changes outcomes. I sat at my desk with the folder open again, sunlight cutting across the pages, highlighting every line like it wanted me to pay attention this time. I did not rush. That is the mistake most people make when they feel wronged. They move fast. They react. They make noise. But noise does not win these kinds of fights. Precision does. I picked up my phone and called the county records office. The woman on the other end had that calm, practiced tone of someone who deals with confusion for a living. I gave her my parcel number, spelled my name slowly, and waited. I could hear typing in the background, keys tapping in a steady rhythm. "Yes, Mr. Caldwell," she said after a moment. "Your property includes a recorded access easement along the eastern boundary." Eastern boundary, 12 feet wide. Exactly where I had seen it. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there for a second longer than necessary, letting the confirmation settle in. Not assumption. Not memory. Record. That is the difference. Outside, the neighborhood carried on like nothing had changed. A lawn mower hummed somewhere down the street. A delivery truck rolled through the entrance, tires crunching lightly as it slowed near the bend. Routine. Predictable. Built on the idea that everything was where it was supposed to be. I closed the folder and grabbed my jacket. The fabric felt heavier than usual, like I was stepping into something that required more than just showing up. The county building sat 15 minutes away, beige walls, flat roof, the kind of place designed to look neutral so nobody questioned what happened inside. The air conditioning hit me the second I walked through the doors, carrying that faint scent of paper and polished floors. I approached the counter, sliding my documents across with steady hands. "I need a certified copy of this easement," I said. The clerk nodded, glancing down at the pages, then back up at me. "No questions. No hesitation. Just process. That is how real authority works. It does not argue. It verifies." 20 minutes later, I walked out with a stamped copy, the seal pressed deep enough into the paper to leave an impression you could feel with your fingertips. That weight mattered, not because of what it said, but because of who recognized it. Back in my truck, I placed the document on the passenger seat carefully, like it was something fragile. Not physically, strategically. The drive back felt different. Slower, more controlled. Every mile brought the pieces into clearer focus. Victoria had relied on visibility, on appearance, on the idea that if something looked official, nobody would question it. But she had overlooked something simple. Visibility works both ways. If I could see their mistake, so could anyone else who knew where to look. I pulled into my driveway, gravel crunching under the tires, and stepped out into the late afternoon light. The fence stood there, still 6 feet out of place, still wrong. But it did not bother me the same way anymore. Because now it was not the problem. It was the proof. I walked past it again, heading straight for the road, for that entrance they had built their authority around. Cars moved in and out, steady flow, each one passing over that narrow strip without a second thought. I stood just off to the side, watching, counting, measuring with my eyes the way my father taught me. Every tire that crossed that line was another confirmation. Another quiet reminder that control is not about who speaks the loudest. It is about who understands the ground beneath their feet. A black SUV slowed as it approached, the driver glancing at me briefly before continuing through. They did not know. None of them did. And that was the point. I slipped the certified document from my jacket, unfolding it just enough to see the seal catch the light. Clean. Official. Undeniable. I folded it back carefully, sliding it into place, and took one last look at the entrance. The stone pillars. The polished sign. The asphalt stretched smooth and confident like it had always belonged there. I nodded once, almost to myself, because what they had built, what they drove through every single day, was not just an entrance. It was a dependency. And the moment you understand what someone depends on, you understand exactly where to apply pressure. The next morning started quieter than the last, but the tension sat heavier in the air, like the calm before something shifts permanently. I woke up before sunrise, the sky still a dull gray, and stepped outside with that same steady rhythm I had learned over years of working land that did not forgive mistakes. The fence stood there, unchanged, still 6 feet inside my boundary, still wrong in a way that now felt almost intentional. I walked its length again, slower this time, counting steps under my breath, measuring distance the way my father used to without needing a tape. 72 steps from the oak tree to the corner stake. It had always been 66. 6 feet. Not random. Never random. I stopped at the end where the new posts met the ground, crouching slightly, running my fingers along the base. Fresh concrete. Still rough. They had done this recently. Fast. Probably early morning, thinking nobody would notice until it was already done. That is how people like Victoria operate. Move first. Justify later. I stood up and looked toward the subdivision again, toward that entrance that had become the center of everything without anyone realizing it yet. Cars were already moving through it, headlights cutting through the early light, engines low and steady. Routine. Assumed. Untouched. For now. I walked back inside and set the folder on the kitchen counter, flipping it open without hesitation. The certified copy sat on top, the seal catching the light again, quiet but absolute. I pulled out a blank notepad and started writing. Not emotions. Not complaints. Facts. Measurements. Dates. Every detail that turned a situation into a case instead of an argument. By the time the sun fully cleared the horizon, I had a list that felt solid in my hands, like something that could stand up on its own. I grabbed my phone and made the next call. A local surveyor. Not the kind you find online with flashy ads, but the kind people recommend when they need something done right the first time. His voice was rough, direct, no extra words. I gave him my address and kept it simple. I need a boundary verification. Full measurement. Today if possible. There was a pause, then a short answer. I can be there in 2 hours. No questions. No hesitation. That is how professionals recognize something real when they hear it. I hung up and stepped back outside, the morning air warming slightly now, carrying the faint scent of cut grass from somewhere down the road. Time moved differently when you were waiting for something that mattered. Not slower, sharper. Every minute had weight. At exactly 2 hours, I heard the truck before I saw it. Diesel engine, steady, purposeful. It pulled into my driveway, tires crunching over gravel, and a man stepped out with a case of equipment that looked like it had been used more than it had been replaced. No small talk, just a nod. Show me the line. I led him to the fence, watching as he set up his tripod, adjusted the instrument with practiced hands, and began measuring with a precision that did not care about opinions. The clicks of his equipment cut through the quiet, each one marking something permanent. He moved methodically, point to point, checking markers, cross-referencing angles, writing numbers down in a small notebook he kept in his pocket. I stayed back, arms crossed, letting him work. Because this was the part that mattered. Not what I believed. Not what Victoria claimed. What could be proven. After about 40 minutes, he straightened up, looking at the fence, then back at his notes. His expression did not change, but his tone carried a slight shift. This is off, he said simply. By how much? I asked, even though I already knew. He glanced back at the line, then at me. Right about 6 feet into your property. Hearing it out loud did something different than knowing it. It turned suspicion into confirmation. He closed his notebook, tapping it once against his hand. You want this documented? I nodded once. Fully. He gave a short nod back, already understanding what that meant. Paperwork. Certification. Something that does not just exist, but holds weight when it needs to. As he packed up his equipment, I looked past him again, toward the entrance, toward the steady flow of cars that had not slowed, had not changed, had not realized anything was different yet. That was the thing about shifts like this. They do not announce themselves. They build quietly until one moment changes everything. I slipped my hands into my pockets, feeling the edge of the folded document inside, and let my gaze settle on those stone pillars for just a second longer than before. Because now, for the first time, everything lined up. The fence, the easement, the measurements, the proof. And once everything lines up, there is only one thing left to do. Decide exactly when to move it back. I did not act that day. Not because I was unsure, but because timing matters more than action when the outcome depends on precision. By late afternoon, the surveyor's report was already in my hands, printed, signed, and sealed with the kind of quiet authority that does not need explanation. I laid it flat on the kitchen table next to the certified easement copy, aligning the edges carefully, like pieces of something that had always belonged together but had just now been brought into the same frame. Outside, the neighborhood carried on like it always did. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A lawn sprinkler ticked rhythmically, water hitting pavement in a steady pattern. Normal, predictable, built on the assumption that nothing underneath it was shifting. I leaned against the counter, arms folded, looking at the documents without touching them. This was the point most people get wrong. They think once they have proof, they need to use it immediately. Confront, accuse, demand. But proof is not a weapon you swing. It is something you place, carefully, exactly where it will matter most. I picked up my phone and opened the county website, scrolling through permit applications, zoning guidelines, access regulations. Dry language, dense paragraphs. The kind of information most people avoid because it feels complicated. But buried inside it were the rules that actually controlled everything. Easements, access rights, modification requirements. Every line written not for convenience, but for enforcement. I found what I needed faster than I expected. Any structure or access point built on or intersecting a private easement required documented permission from the property owner. Not assumed, not implied, documented. I let that sit for a second, reading it again, slower this time, making sure there was no room for interpretation. There was not. I closed the page and slipped my phone back into my pocket, feeling that quiet shift again, the one that happens when uncertainty disappears completely. This was no longer a situation. It was a position. I gathered the documents, sliding them into a clean folder, the kind you use when you intend for someone else to read what you have prepared. No clutter, no emotion, just facts, organized in a way that left no gaps. As I stepped outside, the sun was starting to drop, casting long shadows across the yard, stretching everything just enough to make it look different. The fence cast a line that did not belong. 6 feet too far. Still wrong. But now it felt temporary. I walked past it again, heading toward the road, toward the entrance that had become the center of everything. Traffic was heavier now. Evening routines. People coming home. Headlights flickering on as the light faded. Every car that passed over that strip of land did so without hesitation, without awareness, like they had always been allowed. That was the illusion Victoria had built. Not just control over appearances, but control over assumptions. I stood there for a moment, watching, listening to the steady hum of tires and engines, feeling the rhythm of something that depended entirely on not being questioned. Then I saw her. Victoria's white SUV rolled toward the entrance, slowing slightly as it approached, just like every other car. Smooth, confident, untouched. She did not see me at first. When she did, her expression shifted just enough to register recognition, but not concern. That same controlled smile, the one that suggested she believed everything was still exactly where she wanted it. She lowered her window halfway as she stopped briefly near the edge of the road. Enjoying the view, Ethan? Her tone was light, almost amused, like this was still her conversation to manage. I did not step closer. I did not raise my voice. I just held the folder loosely at my side and looked at her the same way I had looked at the documents earlier. Calm, measured, certain, just making sure I understand it, I said. She tilted her head slightly, waiting for more, expecting resistance, expecting something she could respond to. I did not give it to her. Instead, I glanced past her vehicle, toward the entrance, toward the line she crossed every day without thinking. Then I looked back at her, just long enough for the silence to register. She smiled again, a little tighter this time, then rolled her window up and drove through, disappearing between the stone pillars like nothing had changed. I watched her go, the sound of her engine fading into the neighborhood, blending back into the routine she believed was secure. Then I looked down at the folder in my hand, feeling the weight of it shift slightly as I adjusted my grip. Because what she did not understand yet, what none of them did, was that the moment you stop arguing and start preparing, the outcome is already decided. The next day, I did not wake up early. I let the sun come up without me, let the neighborhood settle into its routine before I stepped into it again. Because today was not about discovering anything new. Today was about setting things in motion. The air felt warmer, heavier, like something was about to shift, but had not yet decided when. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the folder on the counter, the edges clean, the contents exact. No extra pages. No wasted words. Just the kind of information that does not argue, does not negotiate, does not bend. I picked it up and headed out, locking the door behind me with a quiet click that sounded final in a way I could not explain. The drive to the county office felt shorter this time, not because of distance, but because I knew exactly why I was going. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just steps. One after another. The building looked the same as it had the day before. Neutral. Unremarkable. But this time, I walked in like I belonged there. Because I did. I approached the counter and waited my turn, the low hum of conversation and printers filling the space. When it was my turn, I placed the folder down carefully, opening it just enough for the clerk to see the top document. I need to file a formal notice regarding unauthorized use of a private easement, I said, my voice even, controlled. No emotion, just statement. The clerk glanced down, scanning the page, then looked back up at me with a slight shift in expression. Not surprise. Recognition. The kind that comes when something crosses from routine into something that requires attention. Do you have supporting documentation? She asked. I slid the survey report forward, followed by the certified easement copy, each page aligned, each detail exactly where it needed to be. She reviewed them quietly, flipping pages with careful movements, the sound of paper sliding against paper carrying more weight than any raised voice ever could. Everything appears to be in order, she said after a moment. We will process this and notify any affected parties. Affected parties. That was the phrase. Clean. Neutral. But it carried consequences. I nodded once, closing the folder slowly as she handed the documents back after making copies. How long? I asked. Initial notice within 24 hours, she replied, followed by enforcement if necessary. Enforcement. Another word that did not need explanation. I thanked her and stepped away, the sound of my footsteps echoing lightly against the polished floor as I walked back toward the exit. Outside, the sunlight felt sharper, like everything had just come into clearer focus. I stood there for a second, breathing in the warm air, letting the moment settle. Because this was the point where things stopped being private and started becoming official. I drove back home without turning on the radio, the quiet inside the truck matching the quiet certainty that had settled in my chest. When I pulled into my driveway, nothing looked different. The fence was still 6 feet out of place. The yard was still exactly as it had been the day before. But underneath that, everything had already begun to move. I stepped out and walked toward the road again, the gravel crunching under my boots, the sound steady and familiar. The entrance stood there like it always did, stone pillars casting clean shadows, cars moving in and out without interruption. For now, I leaned slightly against the edge of the fence, arms resting casually, watching the flow of traffic the way someone watches something they already understand. A delivery van pulled in, followed by a sedan, then a pickup truck. Routine, repetition, dependency. That word came back again, sharper this time. Because once something depends on a system, it becomes vulnerable to the rules that govern that system. And those rules were no longer being ignored. A few minutes later, I saw her again. Victoria's SUV approached, slowing as it neared the entrance, just like before. This time, she did not roll her window down. She did not speak. She just glanced in my direction briefly, her expression neutral, controlled. But there was something different in the way her eyes held for just a second longer than necessary. Not awareness. Not yet. But something close to it. She drove through without stopping, disappearing into the neighborhood she believed she controlled. I watched until the sound of her engine faded, then shifted my weight slightly, pushing off the fence and straightening up. The air felt different now. Not louder. Not tense. Just set. Because what she had started with a quiet decision in the early morning had now been answered with something far more permanent. And the thing about official processes is simple. Once they begin, they do not stop halfway. The notice arrived faster than most people would expect, but exactly when I knew it would. Late morning, just as the neighborhood settled into that quiet rhythm between departures and returns, a county vehicle pulled up near the entrance. White. Unmarked except for a small seal on the door that most people would not notice unless they were looking for it. I was already outside when it happened, leaning against the fence, feeling the sun warm against my shoulders, watching the same steady flow of cars that had not yet realized anything had changed. 2 officials stepped out, carrying clipboards and a folded set of documents that looked identical to the ones sitting on my kitchen counter. No rush. No raised voices. Just movement with purpose. They walked straight to the entrance, stopping near the base of the stone pillar where asphalt met that narrow strip of land most people never thought about. One of them crouched slightly, checking markers, comparing notes, the other scanning the structure with a quiet focus that did not leave room for interpretation. A car slowed as it approached, the driver hesitating just enough to register that something was different. Not wrong. Not yet. Just different. The officials spoke briefly, low voices. Then one of them pulled a bright notice from his folder and placed it against the pillar, smoothing it flat with the side of his hand. The paper caught the light, sharp against the clean stone, impossible to ignore once it was there. I could not read it from where I stood, but I did not need to. I already knew what it said. Unauthorized structure. Private easement. Immediate review required. Words like that do not shout. They settle. They stay. Another car pulled up behind the first, then another, the small hesitation growing just enough to disrupt the rhythm that had been there for years. Not chaos. Not yet. Just interruption. The kind that makes people start asking questions. I pushed off the fence slowly, walking toward the road, each step steady, measured, like I was approaching something I had already seen play out in my head. By the time I reached the edge, the officials had stepped back, observing, letting the notice do what it was designed to do. One of them glanced in my direction briefly, not with recognition, but with the quiet acknowledgement that comes when 2 people understand the same situation from different sides. I gave a small nod. Nothing more was needed. Behind them, the entrance stood exactly as it had before. Same stone, same sign, same asphalt, but it did not feel the same, because now it had been questioned. And once something is questioned officially, it stops being permanent. A familiar engine sound cut through the air smooth, and controlled. Victoria's SUV approached, slowing as it neared the entrance, just like every other car had. But this time, she stopped completely. Her eyes locked onto the notice before anything else, her posture shifting just slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. She stepped out of the vehicle, heels clicking lightly against the pavement, walking toward the pillar with that same composed expression she always carried. But up close, something had changed. Not panic, not fear, calculation. She read the notice once, then again, slower, the kind of reading that is not about understanding the words, but about realizing what they mean. The officials did not interrupt her. They did not explain. They did not need to. The document spoke for itself. She turned slightly, scanning the area, her gaze passing over the road, the cars, the entrance, and then finally landing on me. For just a second, everything held still. No words, no gestures, just that look. The kind that comes when someone realizes the ground they have been standing on is not as solid as they thought. I did not move. I did not react. I just stood there, hands resting loosely at my sides, letting the moment settle exactly as it was. Because this was not the outcome. This was the shift. The first visible crack in something she had built on assumption instead of authority. She turned back to the officials, her voice low, controlled, asking questions I could not hear from where I stood. They answered calmly, pointing to the document, to the boundary, to the line that had always been there whether anyone acknowledged it or not. One car behind her honked lightly, not out of frustration, but confusion. Another driver leaned slightly out of their window, trying to see what was happening. The rhythm was gone now, replaced by something slower, uncertain, and that was enough. I took a slow breath, letting it out steady, feeling that same quiet certainty settle deeper than before. Because what had started with 6 feet of misplaced fence had just reached the point where everyone else could finally see it too. The line of cars did not move for a moment, and that was all it took for everything to start unraveling in a way that did not need volume or confrontation to be understood. Engines idled. Turn signals clicked in uneven rhythm. A school bus slowed at the edge of the road, its yellow frame catching the sunlight as the driver leaned forward slightly, trying to understand why the entrance was no longer behaving like an entrance. Victoria stood near the pillar, one hand resting lightly against the stone, the other holding the notice like it might change if she looked at it long enough. Her posture was still composed, but the stillness had shifted. It was no longer confidence. It was containment. The officials remained where they were, calm, unmoving, letting the situation expand naturally without interference. That is how authority works when it is real. It does not chase reactions. It allows consequences to appear on their own. I stepped a little closer, not enough to interrupt, just enough to see the details reflected in her expression. Her eyes moved across the page again, slower this time, stopping on specific lines, tracing words that did not leave room for interpretation. Private easement. Unauthorized use. Immediate compliance required. Each phrase landed differently the second time. Behind her, another car honked, sharper now, not aggressive, just impatient. A man stepped out of his truck 2 vehicles back, glancing toward the entrance, then toward the officials, trying to piece together a situation that had no obvious explanation from his perspective. That was the moment it shifted from inconvenience to awareness. Not just for Victoria, for everyone. She turned slightly, addressing the officials again, her voice controlled, but tighter now, like she was choosing each word carefully to maintain something that was already slipping. I could not hear everything, but I caught enough. There must be some mistake. The official closest to her shook his head once, not dismissive, just certain. He pointed to the boundary markers, then to the document, then to the base of the pillar where the overlap existed. Simple, direct, final. No argument, no negotiation, just explanation backed by record. The bus driver leaned out his window now, calling something forward, not angry, just confused, asking if the entrance was closed. That word hung in the air heavier than anything else. Closed. Victoria hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, and that hesitation was louder than any answer she could have given. Because she did not know. Not anymore. The officials stepped slightly aside, creating a clear visual line between the road and the entrance, not blocking it, but not inviting movement either. A subtle shift, but enough. Cars stopped advancing. Engines stayed on. No one wanted to be the first to cross a line that had just been officially questioned. I leaned against the edge of the road sign, arms relaxed, watching the pattern break apart piece by piece. This was not chaos. It was recalibration. The system adjusting itself once the assumption underneath it was removed. Victoria turned again, scanning the line of vehicles, the bus, the drivers now stepping out, the small cluster of attention forming, where there had been none just minutes before. Her control had never been about force. It had been about consistency, predictability, the idea that everything would always work the same way. And now, in the span of a single notice, that consistency was gone. She walked back toward her SUV, slower this time, opening the door but not getting in immediately. Instead, she stood there, one hand resting on the frame, looking back at the entrance, at the pillar, at the paper that had turned something permanent into something conditional. I took a slow breath, the warm air settling in my chest, steady, even. Because this was the point where most people would step forward, say something, claim something, make it known. But I did not. I did not need to. The situation was already speaking louder than anything I could add to it. Another official spoke quietly into a radio, his voice low, controlled, confirming something that would set the next step into motion. Process. Always process. That is what makes it unstoppable. Victoria finally got into her vehicle, closing the door with a soft, controlled motion, not a slam. She sat there for a second, hands on the wheel, staring forward, not moving. Then, slowly, she reversed, backing away from the entrance, turning onto the road, leaving the line of cars and the notice behind her. The bus followed, making a wide turn, rerouting. One by one, the vehicles adjusted, finding other ways, other paths, because that is what people do when something they depend on is no longer available. They adapt, but they remember. I watched until the road cleared, until the noise settled back into something quieter, different, less certain than before. Then I looked at the entrance again, at the stone pillars that had not moved, at the sign that still stood exactly where it had been placed. Nothing physical had changed, but everything else had. Because what used to be automatic now required permission. By the next morning, the entrance did not look like a failure. It looked like a question waiting for an answer. The notice was still there, pressed flat against the stone pillar, edges unmoved, the paper catching the early light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. No cars lined up this time. No hesitation. Because word had already spread. People adjust quickly when something they rely on stops working the way it used to. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee that was still hot this time, the steam rising slowly into the cool air, and walked toward the road without urgency. The fence stood behind me, still 6 feet out of place, still wrong in a way that now felt almost symbolic. Because it was never just about the fence. It was about who decided where lines existed. As I reached the edge of the road, I saw movement at the entrance. Not traffic. Activity. A small crew had arrived, trucks parked neatly to the side, equipment laid out with the kind of organization that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be done. Survey stakes, marking flags, measuring tools, not the kind of setup you bring when you are guessing, the kind you bring when the outcome has already been determined. Victoria stood nearby, arms crossed, sunglasses on despite the low morning sun, her posture rigid in a way that did not match the calm expression she tried to hold. She was not directing anything. Not this time. She was watching. That was new. One of the officials from the day before stood with the crew, going over documents, pointing to the ground, to the edge of the asphalt, to the exact line that had been ignored for years because it had never been challenged. Until now. I took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth settling in my chest, grounding the moment. The crew began marking the boundary, small flags pressed into the dirt at precise intervals, each one a quiet declaration of where things actually belonged. No debate, no discussion, just placement, the kind that cannot be undone with opinion. A resident approached on foot, stopping a few yards back, watching with the same cautious curiosity I had seen the day before. Then another, and another. Not a crowd, just enough people to turn a private correction into something visible, something understood. Victoria finally moved, stepping toward the official, speaking in low tones, her hands making small controlled gestures that suggested she was still trying to shape the outcome. The official listened, nodded once, then responded with the same calm certainty I had seen before. No change in pace, No adjustment in plan, just continuation. She stepped back again, her expression tightening just slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition. The kind that comes when control shifts from assumption to reality. The crew moved to the base of the stone pillar, measuring carefully, confirming what had already been documented. The overlap was small, just enough to matter, just enough to require correction. One of the workers looked up briefly, waiting for confirmation, and the official gave a single nod. That was all it took. The process began. Not destruction, not force, just removal of what did not belong where it was placed. Piece by piece. Deliberate. Controlled. The pillar itself remained intact, but its position relative to the boundary was no longer accepted as fixed. Adjustments were made. Realignments. The entrance did not disappear. It shifted, just enough to respect the line that had always been there. I washed without moving, finishing my coffee slowly, letting the moment settle the way it was meant to. Because this was never about taking something away. It was about restoring something that had been ignored. A line. A right. A boundary that did not need permission to exist. Victoria stood off to the side now, no longer speaking, no longer directing, just observing as the work continued without her input. That was the difference. Not silence. Absence of control. The residents lingered for a while, watching, then gradually moved on, their routines adjusting around the new reality without resistance. Because once something is corrected properly, it does not feel disruptive. It feels inevitable. By midday, the markers were removed, the equipment packed up, and the entrance stood in its new position. Not dramatically different. Just accurate. Aligned. Real. The notice was gone. It did not need to stay. Its job was done. I turned back toward my house, the gravel crunching under my boots, the sound steady, familiar. As I passed the fence, I paused for a moment, looking at the line that had started everything. 6 feet. That was all it had taken. 6 feet to show me where they thought their authority began. 6 feet to show them where it actually ended. I reached out, resting my hand briefly against the wood, feeling the texture under my fingers, solid, grounded, exactly where it should be soon enough. Then I let it go and kept walking. Because the truth is simple. Justice does not make noise. It does not rush. It does not argue. It waits until everything lines up, and then it moves. Exactly as far as it needs to.